How did you pick this one? How did you fall into this story about Lumumba?
Sure. So I'm an editor at Foreign Affairs magazine, and I'd always had a bit of a specialty, a bit of a focus on Africa. And in 2014, I got to travel to what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo to work on an article that I was writing. And the article was about the present day, but I was taken with the country and started reading up on its history. And the more I read, the more I realized there was this great untold story from 1960 and 1961 when the country became independent, immediately fell into chaos. It was front page news of the New York Times every day. And later it got overshadowed by other Cold War crises, but it was really the big Cold War news story of the day.
And basically, like when we think about simple history of the Cold War and words like the CIA and KGB get thrown around, I think what a lot of the people out there like me get to is that, we were overthrowing governments left and right. And it seems to me like when we look at Patrice Lumumba, who's going to be the center of the story here, you had a guy who had an incredible life story, very interesting background growing up under Belgian rule. I do want to start with that in a second. But it wasn't so much that he wanted to be a part of Russia and this was my interpretation, take their side like with the Soviet Union. It was a survival tactic in the sense that he wasn't getting support from the United States. Maybe they were a little scared that he had like some communist political beliefs, and therefore it created this schism in the country that he then bore the brunt of at the end.
Yeah, so the country becomes independent from Belgium. Immediately things go to hell in a handbasket. And Lumumba, who's the country's new prime minister, asks for help from the UN, which sends in peacekeeping forces, asks for help from the United States, which says, no, go through the UN. But the country's still falling apart. It's chaotic. And so then he made the fateful and fatal mistake of asking for help from the Soviet Union. But as you said, you're absolutely right. He was not pro-Soviet. He was not communist. In fact, as I show in the book, all the evidence suggests that he was really more pro-American than pro-Soviet. But U.S. officials and the CIA sort of miscategorized him and thought he was part of this big communist plot to take over Africa. And this was just the height of Cold War paranoia. And they misjudged him and then worked to overthrow him.
Well, let's start at the beginning with it and what I hinted at with how Belgium was even involved with all this. So my understanding is that before 1960, which we'll get to when it started to turn over away from Belgian control, they had been around in the country for at least 50 years, a little more than that. Is that right?
More than that. So Belgian involvement in Congo begins in the 1880s with the creation of the Congo Free State. And so you may have heard of the book King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, which I highly recommend. And King Leopold, the king of Belgium, conquered this colony, created this colony in the middle of Africa. He actually never visited it once, which was interesting. And what was different about it is it wasn't legally part of the Belgian state. It was his personal colony under his personal control. It eventually, after a series of human rights atrocities, there was an outcry globally, and he was forced to hand over the colony to the Belgian government, which then took over, and then continued to run it as a colony until 1960.
And I guess like one of the things that we don't really think about is the cultural effect that has on people's language and identity. I mean, colonialism is this. It still happens, but it's this very past history as well, where countries from, say, Europe and even America, went into other countries and imposed their way of living. But, what did he change, the language of the country? What did they speak when he went there? And that turn over to, French as they spoke in Belgium? How did that go down?
Yeah, so, most of Africa at that time, there was a real mix of different ethnic groups that were then suddenly arbitrarily forced into one colony because these were Europeans drawing lines on a map, at the Berlin conference in the 1880s, carving up Africa. And that had little to do with the actual on-the-ground reality of who was living where. So you have the creation of this artificial state, this colony, and everyone. There were many different languages spoken, and suddenly it was all technically under the control of the Belgians. French was the official language, so Lumumba grew up learning French and spoke that. But yeah, you really had with colonialism in Belgium, in Congo as elsewhere, you had the imposition of these European systems and laws and culture and mores onto an African context that was, often not receptive to it.
And did a lot of Belgians move there? Like, did they have a ton of people on the ground, or was it more just like the government and they'd send people in and out to do business and plunder?
So it wasn't primarily a settler colony like Kenya, for instance, was with the British. There were about 100,000 Belgians in the Congo by the time of independence in 1960, but it was run largely as a sort of hands-off operation, and there were not 100,000. There were 100,000 Belgians, but there were 13 million Congolese.
Right,
So it was not. There wasn't a huge settler presence, unlike in other places in Africa.
And I'm not sure if you said this right at the beginning when I was messing with the camera, but what types of resources were there in the Congo? Like, what were the primary loot that Belgium was looking to take advantage of?
Yeah, well, it changed over time. It was rubber at one point. It was ivory at another point. Humans. There was a slave gathering operation before the Belgians came, and then by the time of independence, it was really minerals, uranium, and then copper. And to this day, the country is extremely rich in natural resources.
So there's a ton there, obviously, to take advantage of, and a bunch of the other countries in Africa had things that, whether it be Belgium or Great Britain or France, that they took advantage of. Kind of crazy part of history. But what about like the I don't know if I want to use the word brainwashing of society, but when it comes to the resources that the people had, like, did the Belgians come in and affect how the citizens could even be educated, or how they could make it in society such that they were held down to a lower class system so that they could kind of rule over them? Or was there anything like that too?
Yeah, so there was de facto segregation, and there was really tight control on the types of education that Congolese could receive. So the Belgians were petrified that they would create a politically aware class that would start demanding independence, which happened anyways. But so they, black people were allowed to become veterinary assistants, but not doctors, clerks, but not lawyers, that sort of thing. And so there was a real cap on how far you could rise if you were Congolese. And they opened, I think it was in 1956, they finally opened the first university in Congo that was open to the African population as well as the European population. But that was belated. And in contrast to other European powers like France and the United Kingdom, Belgium really worked assiduously to keep the population, not educated. And that reflected in Lumumba's own education himself, and we can talk about that in a bit. But he never advanced higher than a school for postal clerks because he wasn't able to.